Thanks everyone for coming. I always like to begin right off by lowering everyone's expectations. Today, all I have is the title, and I'm going to have to make it up after the title of the talk. So no need to expect anything too great here, but hopefully the conversation together will be great. And with respect to that, yes, you can put anything in the chat while we're going along. So if I see something in the chat, I might be able to address it right away. If it's really a pressing point, you can just interject yourself into the conversation. I certainly don't mind that. And hopefully, I won't speak more than 15 or 20 minutes somehow, so that there's maximum time for discussion. So yes, gratitude, first of all, to Frank for the invitation, and to Jeremy Rourke, who introduced me to Frank and is, I think, a member of your circle as well. Thanks for the introduction, Frank. I forgot I sent that to you, so that's wonderful. I was going to put some things in the chat, among which were some of the things you just read. That's sort of my cosmic bio about activism and spirituality. And for kind of more practical insights into who I am and what I do, I'm going to now put in the chat a number of links, really quite a few links to various things I'm involved with. And if you save the chat, then you can go check those out anytime. My theme today, the title that Frank and I liked, is Why Climate Justice Means Social Justice, and why we need both in these times of crisis. And that was a last-minute decision to title the talk, and I'm glad I waited, because the events of the past week have certainly altered what can be said that might be relevant and up to date. And I will say some things about those in the remarks I make. I'm also going to start a timer so I do not speak to you uninterrupted for more than 20 minutes. So we might want to think about that title and what it might mean, and I'll put that title in the chat as well so that we can have that in front of ourselves. There it is. Oftentimes when what can I say actually? Climate justice, or some form of climate and radical social justice, are much the reason I get up in the morning and feel that, we're lucky to be alive at this time of crisis, to be on the planet in this moment of existential future in question. In the 2020s, which from a climate point of view is what I call the decade of decision. That is what humanity does in the next 10 years, in the next 5 years, in the coming year, is going to determine what prospects we have, we in the great sense of everybody alive on the planet right now, of coming through these multiple crises, which are unprecedented in scope, reasonably as well as we can. And I think the message I give when I talk about these matters is that we actually have a chance, albeit a small one, of arriving in a couple of decades, or 3 maybe. I hope to live to 95. That would be 2050. But who knows how long one's going to live. My hope is that by 2050, because of what we do now, not waiting, we will live in a world that's actually far superior to the one we live in right now, despite the inexorable progression of a climate crisis, which is like, essentially the climate situation is kind of like an individual diagnosis that one has terminal cancer, because it's not going to end well. I don't believe that humanity is going to become extinct necessarily, but I don't think it will continue unless we do certain things now. So the climate crisis by itself is, I think, that bad. I think the climate science is clear about that. I'm not a scientist. I'm not even a social scientist. I teach sociology, but I don't really think of it as a science because the world is too complex for us to understand how things are connected to each other. And yet that's what we have to do. We have to connect the dots of multiple crises to understand the situation that we're in. And to give you a short list, but fairly comprehensive, I think, I believe that we're living through 6 simultaneous crises that are each of them global and life-threatening by themselves. And they're the following. We have an economic condition. We live in a world that's characterized by what scholars and activists might refer to as neoliberal global capitalism. And the problem, one of the big problems there economically, is that that is a structure that creates inequality. The basic outcome of that is more and more inequality between nations, within nations, everywhere. That is what capitalism does, and that's what the kind of capitalism that we've found ourselves almost but not quite locked into in the last few decades, global capitalism, based on a neoliberal philosophy that the market determines everything. That's an engine of inequality. That everybody has to, it has devastating effects on the vast majority of the people on the planet. We also have a political crisis, which I don't have much trouble asserting after the events of the past week. But the way I usually talk about it is that for quite some time now, let's think this whole new century that's 20 years old now, we've had what we might call a democracy deficit, meaning that where there are democracies of whatever type, people have essentially lost faith, not just in the governing parties, but in all the parties that are options. That those parties are adequate to the moment and that can solve the deep crises that we experience. So we have Democrats and Republicans. Now we know there's a big difference. I don't want to get sidetracked there. I'm very happy that Joe Biden won. I'm delighted that the 2 senators, the 2 Democrats won the Senate for Georgia and for the United States effectively. And that the Congress, the Democrats, retain not a bigger majority than they had, but a majority nonetheless. This is great, right? But when we think about it, what kind of choice was that? How great are our lives going to be in the next 4 years? They're going to be better than under 4 more years of Trump. But we all know that we are going to be disappointed in terms of the dreams, the hopes, the real needs that people have, the real vision and courage that's called for politically in this country. And that's true all around the world, unfortunately. So that's a political crisis, that people no longer feel that parties can solve the crises. They are part of the crisis now. The third is a kind of cultural, and to make a big generalization, I think that we live in cultures characterized by violence. Essentially, we're living in a culture of violence, whether that's on the most intimate relations in a family, whether that's in a community where we have police violence, whether that's on a national level where we have the violence that we saw in the Capitol, or globally where the United States is the leading military master of things, supposedly, and deals violence to the rest of the world in a system we could call militarism. So in addition to those economic, political, and cultural crises, which have pretty much characterized life as long as I've been alive, for half a century, actually a little more than half a century, we have the climate crisis, number 4, the climate crisis, which is unique. And I think I tried to, articulate something of the scope of it. I've never compared it to cancer as a sort of diagnosis for the planet before today. But it's hard to find the words to express what the climate crisis is doing to exacerbate all the others, and moreover puts us on a tight timeline. Unlike the others, it used to be that you could fight your whole life for a better world, and when you died, you could hope that the next generation could carry that on and do better. But with the climate crisis, we have to do it now. Everybody alive on the planet right now has to do whatever it is that they think they can and should do. And even then, we have no guarantees with respect to the climate crisis and the inevitable sort of deterioration of life on Earth, the conditions of life on Earth. Number 4. A year ago, that would have been my analysis. We have a quadruple crisis. But of course, a little less than a year ago, the pandemic hit us. Now we have the corona crisis. Truly, everybody can see that that's a global crisis, which is interesting about it for the first time, because climate is not recognized on that level. And the corona crisis is an existential crisis for every individual alive on the planet, and it's felt. And of course, we've seen how all our institutions, at least in the United States, have proven not just inadequate, but the US has pretty much the worst record in dealing with the corona crisis. We have the most deaths, we have the most cases, we have the least acceptance of science, and we're now riding the greatest wave of the growth of the corona crisis, even as we all have the vaccines right front and center. The fact is that every day we're setting new records for the number of deaths in the United States because of the spike for Christmas and New Year's. And that's going to get worse for the next couple of weeks, and then we just don't know. That's 5 crises, quintuple crises. So one of the pieces I shared with you, I think, no, it's called the sextuple, because on May 25th of last year, that's my birthday, George Floyd was murdered by the police in the streets of Minneapolis. And that touched off the most significant political and social justice movement of the last year in the United States, which we could refer to, if we want, as the Floyd Rebellion or Black Lives Matter too. And of course, the rebellion is not the crisis, but the structural racism that has been made a lot more visible by these sad events is the 6th crisis. So there's a crisis, and it's most acute in this nation. I'm not going to compare with other nations, but the question of race and ethnicity, the situation of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinas, Latinx people, indigenous people. We can sort of look at the history of this and really feel and ask ourselves, what has changed for the last 500 years? That's 6 crises. That's kind of daunting. They're interconnected. They make each other worse. When one gets worse, the others are going to inevitably be affected, usually not for the better. That's the bad news. The good news is that by confronting any of these crises, we realize that we are in a set of interconnected crises. And by working on any of these crises, even individually in a silo, things can get better as well as worse. And this depends on social movements, it depends on people, on organizations, and the possibility of wider and wider scale movements, or what we might call systemic transformation. And I'm going to share with you in the chat what I sort of tongue-in-cheek call my theory of change, because activists are supposed to have theories of change. So I reduced mine to 8 words, the first 3 of which are connect the dots. That's what we've been talking about. Connecting the dots to understand the situation we're in, and connecting the dots for movements and our own selves in movements to think about what to do. The climate crisis is the one that I've spent the last 10 years of my life living for. And the climate crisis is one of those movements, the global climate justice movement, which is really not a movement, it's a network of movements, is encouraging because it, like other movements, has started to connect those dots. And that's why the title of the talk is Climate Justice Means Social Justice. It means all these things are connected. And in our movements, it's all to the good. The more we can see that, the more that we can act based on an understanding that things are connected, the better chance that gives us of coming together, not just with our natural movement allies, but with the many, many movements everywhere that need to come together, that need to connect to each other, that need to have, in many cases, the difficult conversations that have kept them apart or kept them actually at odds with each other. And of course, that's what power wants. Power wants our movements to be divided. Power wants our analyses to be one-sided. That's part of the secret of the structure that we live in, the so-called 1%, the global and political economic elites that run things, ostensibly are in control of things. So confronting the climate crisis means participating in movements of all kinds, and stopping bad things from happening, like pipelines and like new coal plants and like terminals for natural gas and like a new mine opening somewhere, because everywhere these things happen, people live and people suffer. And climate justice refers, in some concise understandings of it, is that the crisis, the global warming, the climate crisis has caused the impact of it. It's those who are least responsible for it, first and worst. And justice requires the perpetrators of that to, first of all, be stopped from what they're doing. Second, to be made to relinquish power. Third, to make some kind of basic reparation. And that's why you speak of the United States or the 100 biggest corporations in the history of the world, responsible for the vast majority of emissions, or the global north in that sense, historically responsible for the vast majority of emissions, and in fact richer. Global north means the rich countries, because we have used up all the carbon budget historically to get there. And so we have huge debt to the rest of the world. And at the very least, we here in the United States have the opportunity to stop further climate injustice and to start to appropriate the resources that exist here to make reparations to communities in the United States of all kinds, the frontline and fence line communities, communities of color, everywhere in the United States and well beyond to the world. The The second part, I think, of confronting the climate crisis, aside from participating in these movements to stop these bad things from continuing, is to, the fancy word for it is to construct systemic alternatives. That is, to be able to think proactively and in a kind of visionary way, to use our imaginations and our hearts, our resources, especially with others, to create and co-create a different way of living. And this is happening also all over the world. And the side point is that, and this is something that I love both to experience for myself and to create spaces where my students in particular can start to work on these problems and lead on them. It's fun to do this. It's fun because you meet the most amazing people you will ever meet in your life. And I've met, I don't know how many people from the larger global climate justice movement in my life, and I've been inspired by every single one. What they stood for, who they were, how they acted, and the love that is felt with fellow activists who really see each other. So it's fun. It's not like going to ruin your life. It's quite the contrary. It's going to give your life purpose. It's going to give you an amazing set of people to live with. And it's going to give you a lot of positive feedback that doing this can work and is a way of life. And among these systemic alternatives, I'm going to mention three real briefly because I want to stop. Frank mentioned one of the organizations I'm in is called System Change, Not Climate Change. That is a catchy slogan of the global climate justice movement, and it was taken by an organization I'm part of called System Change, Not Climate Change, which is a network of North American-based Canada, US, not so much Mexico, eco-socialists. That is, people who see as the alternative to what we have now, an ecological society, a socialist society in the sense not of all the baggage that that word carries. The basic meaning of socialism for me is sharing. And that this movement, moreover, has to be intersectional. It has to connect the dots that we're talking about. And it has to acknowledge the leadership of communities of color, of young people, of women. It's led by women, in my experience. So my 20 minutes is up. I've mentioned one systemic alternative. Another dimension is called transition towns. That's a movement, a network globally of communities that are trying to bring about sustainable, just transition away from what we have to something better, which goes under many names and in many forms. Transition US is a network of 170 such communities. And I'm going to close with the third systemic alternative because it has to do with right here in Isla Vista, which is, as Frank mentioned, a dream, a vision, a set of friends called ecovista. And ecovista has joined the Transition US movement as one of those 170 communities. The website of ecovista, I'm going to put in the chat. I would love it if people visited it and poked around and saw some of the amazing things that not just students, but students and community members together and in increasing numbers and in beautiful ways. Oh, I see I didn't send my theory of cosmic transformation. There it is. And I'm going to close with the link to ecovista. You're all invited to be part of ecovista, even if you live, say, in Santa Barbara, which we consider part of greater ecovista or Goleta. And the next opportunity to meet with us is next Friday, the 15th at noon. We meet every other Friday, basically. Go to the website and you'll find us in a general assembly. And there we meet each other and we talk about what projects we're doing and so forth and so on. Ecovista is only a couple of years old. There's 300 people on the email list. There's maybe 40 core people and people who come to the General Assembly, and it's open to everyone. And we'd love to have every single person here. Jeremy Rourke, who joined us. Jeremy, I acknowledged you with gratitude at the very beginning for introducing me to Frank. Jeremy Rourke, Ash Valenti, who's on this call, are sort of, let's say, upstanding members of what we might think of as a leaderful movement. And there, I'm going to stop. Thanks everyone for listening, and look forward to anything y'all want to raise. Ash has posted the Instagram in the chat, and for those of you who are younger, Instagram might be a good way to connect with ecovista for sure. It's a marvelous, what's to say? Our motto is kind of like, let's change the world, let's do it ourselves. Let's have fun while we do it. Let's live in a way that affirms life, because that's the way to live. And that's the sort of antidote to the way we are made to live now. I didn't really mention the uprising. Horrible, horrible. And so much can be said about it and is being said about it. And you'll see tomorrow whether the Democrats want to try to organize an impeachment, et cetera, et cetera. This is not over. It's a bad indication of things to come. And, you know, there's a collection of white supremacists, Proud Boys, the people with the Confederate flags, the people that thought the way to change the country is to break down the doors of a building that stands for democracy in the United States and threaten our elected representatives. So, yeah, I'm told tonight at 7 p.m. our time, CNN is going to have some special presentation where they're going to present an awful lot of the images, at least, and that are coming from this. This story is huge. It's historic. It's a big deal. And again, I'm going to stop for Q&A. Over to you guys. Thanks for listening.